In today's video, I'll show you how to scan for gaps in ThinkorSwim very easily with just a few lines of code. We'll build a gap up scan along with a gap down scan, and along the way, you'll learn some key fundamentals which allows you to be a little bit more clever in building scans that work for your specific gap trading strategy. Now let's get started with first understanding what gaps are so we can define them using some simple code. Now, if we take a look at an example in this picture, here's an example of a gap down. The way we can define this gap down is the high price of our current bar is less than the previous day's low price. That gives us this open section right here, and that open section is what we call a gap down. On the opposite side, here's an example of a gap up, and it's the exact opposite. Our low price is greater than the previous day's high price. That gives us this open area, which we call the gap up. Now, each of these are variables that we have available to us in ThinkorSwim, both the high price along with the previous day's low and high prices. So we can use that to build some very simple scans. For the scan that we're going to be building, we'll build a gap up scan. And here we're looking for not just a gap up, but that gap needs to be a minimum gap percentage. So say a gap of at least 5% or more. We'll also add in two basic liquidity filters, one around volume, the other around a minimum share price. After we build the gap up scan, you should find it very easy to build the inverse, the gap down scan. The only key difference here is we're going to be using the gap downs instead of the gap ups. Everything else remains the same. Now let's jump into ThinkorSwim and start building this first scan. And once we have the knowledge from this video, we can build on it and build some more sophisticated gap scans in future videos. Now inside of ThinkorSwim, I'm going to start first by creating a study. The reason I'm doing this is so we can first test to make sure our code is working before we put it inside of the scan tab. Now inside of our study, let's start by first defining a gap down. I'll say def gap down, and we said gap downs were places where our high price of the current bar is less than the low price from the previous bar. Similarly, a gap up was all of the places in which we had the low price greater than the high price from the previous candle. Let's test to see if this is working. I'll use the add chart bubble code to very easily test what this variable is outputting when it's plotting false. So I'll say gap down is true. Plot this on the closing price of whatever the candle is. Use the gap down value inside of the chart bubble, and I'll make it color.yellow so it's easy to spot. Now once I click OK, we should find all of the places in which we have a gap down, and it should be easy to spot those with these chart bubbles. Let's zoom into one to see if it's working the way we would expect. We can see we have a chart bubble of 1 here, and this is an example of a gap down. Our high price is less than the low price of the previous candle. Let's see if we can find another example. Here's another example of a gap down. Our high price is less than the low price of the previous candle, and we have a gap, even though a small gap. Let's test the gap ups now. I'll simply plot in gap up for our chart bubble, click apply. And now if we zoom out, we can find all of the different gap ups. So with these chart bubbles, it's very easy to spot that our gap up and our gap down code is working. Now the one thing you should notice is there's a lot of different chart bubbles here. That's because we're simply looking for any kind of gap. You saw a few examples there yourself of some gaps that were very narrow. So say you want to find only the gaps that are of a minimum threshold. There we can add in a new variable. Since we want the user to be able to easily change this, I'll call it an input variable, and we'll say minimum gap percentage, and that, let's set it equal to 5% to start off. I can plug this variable into our calculation here so that instead of looking at just the previous bar's low, we're looking at whatever that previous bar's low is minus 5%, and that allows us to find all of the places in which we have a gap of at least 5% in this case. I'll do the same for our gap ups. Close that out. And now let's go ahead and give this a test run. Let's see if we now have the chart bubbles reduced to only the places in which our gap up is greater than 5%. Let's click apply. And now you should see that all of the chart bubbles that we used to see have gone away, and instead we're seeing only the places in which our gap is greater than 5%. We can see that very easily. Let's measure this just to make sure. I'll test using the high price of that previous bar to the low price of our current bar. That's 5.73%, greater than our 5% threshold. So now we know that our gap up and our gap down code is working the way we would expect. I can simply copy paste this and now come inside of our scan tab. I'm going to be running this scan in all optionable. That's a public watch list available. Let's start with adding in our stock price filter here first. I'll say our closing price needs to be at least $5 or more. I'll add a study here, navigate to volume, average volume, and here our average 50-day volume should be greater than 1 million shares on the daily time frame. And now I'll click Add Filter, select Study one more time, but in our dropdown, instead of Volume, we'll select Custom this time. Now here, I'll navigate to ThinkScript Editor, and I'm going to paste in those 3 lines that we wrote on the indicator page. Now we'll get one error here, which says, hey, you need at least one plot to be defined, and that's what ThinkorSwim is going to search for. So I'll say Plot Signal, and let's look first for all of the places in which we have a gap up. Market's been on a tear. Let's see where we have a gap greater than 5%. If I run the scan, we see we have one symbol that meets that criteria, Silk. And if we come inside of Silk, we can see that we do indeed have a gap greater than 5%. If we come back into our scan tab, let's change this from a gap up now to a gap down. Click OK. Rerun the scan. We have one symbol that meets this, ZNTL. And here we can see that we have that gap that's greater than the 5%, 22.42%. Now, what happens if you'd like to find some more higher quality symbols here? Some of these were not so great. Well, we can expand this to be a little bit wider. So maybe instead of 5%, the gap should be 2%. Let's rerun this and see what we get. Now we have an extra energy that's also hit our criteria. If we run this, but this time for our gap ups, see if we get some more symbols there with the market on this rally. And now we have one additional symbol here as well. So you can play around with these different gap percentages to either expand or widen the basket of symbols that you'd like to see. If I came down to 1% with the gap up, you'll start to find even more symbols. I hope you found this video helpful for those of you looking to learn how to build some gap scans inside of ThinkorSwim. In future videos, we'll continue building on this to build more gap scans that allow you to build on this knowledge base. Take care, everyone. Good luck trading, and I'll see you in our next update.